Anaphylactic reaction, a patient who was unresponsive. Hey you guys, what's up? It's Casey, and today I'm gonna be telling you guys about my EMT clinics on the ambulance. So we're just gonna jump right in. So my EMT program, I live in Missouri, they required 24 hours worth of clinicals, and I already work in an ER. So I decided I wanted to do my hours on the ambulance. So my shift started at 7 a.m. and then went to 7 p.m., but I actually ended up staying a little bit longer because we were required to have so many patient contacts, and right when I was leaving, they got a call, and so I wanted to stay to get another patient contact. So the ambulance I was on, it was actually really interesting because there's basically, depending on how your EMS works in your county or your town, you can have like stations that are like 24-hour stations, which basically means that the people working on that ambulance are there for a full 24 hours, or you can have stations where it's designated into shifts. So my station was a shift station, so that means someone is there from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and then they're switching out people from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Very similar to how the hospital works with day shift and night shift. So that was the station I was at. So started the shift at 7 a.m. and the first thing we did is we went through the ambulance. So we made sure everything was stocked. We made sure we had all the correct supplies. We made sure that the ambulance was ready to go. As a student, I obviously didn't know how the ambulance was supposed to be set up. So I more watched and sat back and asked questions. First couple hours of my shift, I was with a EMT and a paramedic. So that was kind of nice to see both sides of things. The EMT I was with, she actually was only working 8 hours that day. So then at 1 p.m. she was replaced by a medic. But it was just cool because basically the medic checked all the drugs and all that stuff, and then the EMT checked all the supplies. Very similar to stuff that like I would do as a tech in the ER. So after we made sure the ambulance was good to go, went through all of our checks, we used this system, and I'm totally blanking on what it's called, but basically you're telling the EMS coordinators in the 911 call center that your ambulance is ready to roll and that we're ready to receive calls. So after our checklist was done and the ambulance was ready, we used this online system to say our ambulance was ready and that we could start receiving calls. And almost immediately after we did that, we got a call. Our first call was an anaphylactic reaction. It was a jogger who had eaten a croissant right before their jog, and unfortunately they're allergic to nuts. Did not realize that there were hazelnuts in this croissant. So like mid-jog started having an anaphylactic reaction. So we went to the scene, lights and sirens. By the time we arrived on scene, fire was already there, and a lot of the firefighters in my town are actually EMTs, and they had already started a nebulizer treatment, which is amazing because that's what we were gonna do. So we walk on scene, and this was my first call, and something I kind of regret is I wish I would have asked like who I should follow on the call. Like, should I be following the paramedic or should I be following the EMT? Like, basically, what is my role? Because when we rolled up on scene, the EMT was driving, the paramedic was in the passenger seat, and then I was in the back just because there were only 2 seats up front. And the paramedic like immediately jumped out and evaluated the patient, and I kind of waited for the EMT, and I wish I didn't do that because the EMT had to bring out the stretcher and had to grab the bag that we take to help evaluate the patient that has the equipment we need. And by the time, you know, we brought the stretcher in the bag, the paramedic was ready to load and go. So I kind of missed that whole patient evaluation, and that is my tip to you guys, is ask who you're training with, who you should follow, and follow the first one on the scene, because you want to be there for everything. Because by the time we walked up, he had thrown an IV in her and everything and was ready to take her to the hospital. So what was crazy is because she was on a jog, she was literally 2 minutes from the hospital. Like, I'm talking around the block. So it was a very, very short call. I mean, we were maybe on scene, I'm talking minutes, like less than 3 minutes. And then once she was in the ambulance, he had already had an IV in her, and he had pushed IV Benadryl. And then literally by the time he pushed the IV Benadryl, flushed the IV, we were literally pulling into the ambulance bay of the hospital because she was just that close. So then we arrived to the hospital and we were directed to a room. I helped offload the patient, and then I listened to report. But really on that call, because fire was there and already started treatment, and because I kind of waited to help the EMT out, I really didn't get to interact with the patient that much. So that is my tip to you guys, because that was honestly probably the best call of the day, just care-wise. But you know, that's just how it goes. So then after that, we went back to the ambulance base. We cleaned the ambulance, that way it was ready for the next patient, marked the ambulance on service, and then we waited for the next call. That's the thing about EMS is, you know, that's the thing about EMS is you're busy when you're busy, but then when you're not on calls, there's really not a lot to do. So I was super lucky that I had time to study. And so that's probably one of the benefits of being an EMT on the ambulance versus the ER is you do have a lot of downtime, just because in the ER, I literally have no downtime. And so I was able to talk to the medic and the EMT and ask them questions. And the EMT was currently getting her medic license, and she was telling me how she gets a lot of time to study during her downtime. But obviously that just depends from call to call. Before we continue, if you guys didn't know, my name's Casey. I'm actually an ER tech, and I make tons of ER tech content about emergency medicine and ways to kind of get into healthcare before your career starts, and opportunities that are available to people who might still be in school but are wanting to get direct patient care. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can learn all about how you can get involved too. After a little bit of downtime, we had our next call. Our next call was an elderly woman who was really fatigued and said that she couldn't even get out of bed. So we responded to that. Fire came on scene as well, just because we needed help transferring her out of her home. It was a very, very tight squeeze, and we had to put a tarp underneath her, and there were like 4 of us that helped carry her out. And she was not in the best shape, very fragile, couldn't even speak. She was so fatigued. And I learned my lesson. I learned to follow the medic first, because the EMT had to grab the bag that we used, as well as the stretcher, which we couldn't even bring the stretcher into the house because it was so narrow. So that was really interesting to me, just because obviously in EMT school we learned how to put people on a tarp, but I had never done an actual patient before. So that was really cool to be a part of. We as well checked this patient's blood sugar, just because they were so weak. They didn't say they were diabetic, but they also said they had not been to a doctor in 50 years. So we checked that. This patient did not allow the paramedic to start a IV for whatever reason. So the paramedic did not start one, and we transferred them to the hospital and gave report. And then we made sure that the ambulance was ready for the next patient, and we marked ourselves in service. So really quick, I wanted to talk about the bag that we use to go evaluate patients. It's actually so cool because in the ER I work at, everything we need is in a set of cabinets, and they have condensed basically all of the supplies you could need into this backpack, and it's all organized in compartments. So like one compartment is all about IV access. It has IV catheters, IO kits, IV tubing. Another compartment is airways, so you've got non-rebreathers, nasal cannulas, OPAs, NPAs. And then another compartment would be like bleeding control. So you've got gauze, tourniquets, hemostatic dressing. And it was really cool just to see how that was organized. And I mean, it's a huge backpack. The thing is super heavy, but you take that with you to every single call, just because when the calls are paged out via the 911 operator, it's very generic. and you never really know what you're gonna walk into, so you wanna make sure you're always prepared. So we always bring that bag with us. So after that call, we had more downtime, which was great because I got to study a little bit, ask more questions about EMS. It's really cool. The medic I was with had been in EMS for over 40 years, so he was super knowledgeable, and I loved to just pick his brain and get his perspective on things. After a bunch of downtime, and since we had no calls, we were actually scheduled to transport a patient. This patient was inpatient at the hospital, but had to go to another part of the hospital, which was across a physical street, and because they required imaging. And with COVID, unfortunately, the hospital didn't have a transporter, because normally they would have a transporter in like a medical van, and they'd put the patient in a wheelchair and just transport them in the van across the street. But with COVID, they don't have those people anymore, so they're using EMS. So we picked up the patient from their room, just explained to them, hey, you get to ride in an ambulance to go across the street. And then we dropped them off at imaging. It was very uneventful, but obviously super necessary, and the patient was very appreciative. And then we actually got a call. So then we did not have to take that patient back from imaging. Another ambulance service took them back. Our next call was someone who was nausea, vomiting, and just really weak. So we arrived on scene, and the patient was covered in vomit, and they were just super weak, could barely walk. So we helped transfer the patient to the stretcher, and fire was on scene, so they helped us do that just because the patient was so weak and could barely walk. I took vitals, as well as took the patient's blood sugar because they said they were diabetic. And then the paramedic put in an IV. And by the time we had done all that, again, we were already at the hospital. My city is pretty condensed, and there's actually multiple hospitals in my city. So when we're on calls within the city limits, we're very close to hospitals, which is really nice. So then we basically drove again around the corner, and we offloaded the patient, gave patient report, and then we marked ourselves, well, cleaned the ambulance, and then we marked ourselves ready to be in service again. And then we had a lot of downtime. We probably had like an hour and a half of downtime before we got our next call. Our next call was another patient transfer. So this was a patient who was being discharged from the hospital and needed a ride back to their nursing home. And I'm gonna be honest, this call was, I hate to say boring, because the patient was very appreciative, and obviously we want to give care to those who need it. But we basically were essentially Uber drivers because the patient was stable, they were being discharged. They just needed a ride back from their nursing home, and the nursing home was not able to do that. So we picked up the patient from their room, got report from the nurse, and then we loaded them onto the stretcher, loaded them onto the ambulance. And this was the part that was boring. It was an hour drive to their nursing home. So drove to the nursing home, offloaded them, gave report to the nursing home. The nursing home staff was amazing. Like you could really tell that they missed this resident, which warmed my heart. And then we had to drive an hour back with no patients. So that was kind of weird, being in the ambulance for a whole hour just like by myself, because I was in the back while the paramedic and the other paramedic were driving, because like I said, the one EMT who I started the shift with, she left midway through the shift, so now I'm with two paramedics. So then we drove back, and then it was about now the end of my shift. It was about 7 p.m. and I was like kind of loading my stuff up in my bag, and then right as I was walking out, they like yelled, they're like, hey, we have another call. So I decided to throw my stuff back into the EMS room, and I went on the call with them. This call was actually a patient who was unresponsive in a dorm room. So I'm thinking unresponsive, and we show up and the patient is not unresponsive. They are sitting upright, chit-chatting. A very concerned bystander had seen that this person was basically just sleeping very heavily in the common areas of the dorm and called 911. But then obviously the commotion of calling 911 and whatnot woke up this person, and the person was intoxicated, but they knew who they were alert and oriented. So we asked the person, you know, do you feel you need to go to the hospital? And they said, no, I'm just been drinking all day. And we did not feel that they were a threat to themselves or they needed medical care. So the paramedics just, you know, we did a basic set of vitals just to make sure he felt that they were okay. And then we told the patient, as long as you have someone safe and sober who's an adult to take care of you, we don't see a reason you need to go to the ER unless you want to go to the ER. This patient did not want to go to the ER, so they called a friend who was sober and over 18 who could take care of them for the night. We waited for that friend and we just explained to the friend the situation. Because really there was nothing medically the patient needed. Vitals were stable, they were alert and oriented, they knew who they were just sleeping heavily on a couch in the common room of a dorm. You know, being drunk does not require medical intervention most of the time, unless there is something, you know, really off about them. And the paramedics, both paramedics, felt that this patient would be safe going home. So we had them sign a waiver saying, you know, you're declining to go to the hospital. And the patient signed that waiver, and then we turned them over to their sober friend. And that was my shift, you guys. I actually had some really good calls. So I think I ended up, that shift was like 13 and a half hours just because that one call ran over. And because, of course, the sober friend took a minute to show up and we didn't want to leave the patient without the sober friend being there. But yeah, let me know what you guys thought of this format of videos. And if you guys didn't know, I'm actually an ER tech. So I upload videos regularly about working in the ER, balancing it with school. And I would really appreciate if you guys subscribed. And I'll see you in the next one.